Okay, fantastic. Welcome, as I was saying. So, we're talking about natural wine tonight. Oftentimes, this is a topic that can be quite contentious. It causes a lot of debate in the wine world, not only about the definition of a natural wine, but also where natural wines fit in with the wine world, right? And I mean, they certainly do. But my hopefully tonight, I hope to offer a little bit more of an impartial perspective. But of course, I want to be like totally transparent about my kind of my feelings about natural wine or the term natural wines. Does anybody want to share before we get started, maybe your perspective of natural wine or any of your thoughts on it? And it could just be you don't have a perspective, right? But maybe some of the things you hear or that you think of when you consider natural wine, or maybe on the flip side, if you go to a wine bar, a restaurant, or a retail shop and you ask for natural wine, what are you expecting to get? And you can answer or you can put it in the chat. And if nobody wants to has anything to say about it, we'll move on. So the reason that I asked this question, I thought I saw somebody speaking, but I didn't hear anything.
Yeah, we are on mute.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, in terms of natural, I would usually think that the wine is grown, organically and without chemicals. It's not fortified with any, eggs or sugar or whatever. Just ode to natural. Just whatever the grape has to bear. That's how the wine results. I mean, that's
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like to say, working when I work at the bar at Corkbud, we're not a natural wine bar, but we do oftentimes have people that come in and ask if we do have any natural wines on our list. And of course we do. And I sort of like to ask people to expand a little bit further on what they're looking for, because using a natural wine as an overarching umbrella term is a little bit too vague, right? Because it sort of gives the impression that natural wine is a style when really it should be considered as a philosophy, right? And using that philosophy, you can and should be able to make wine in many different styles. So because the term also natural wine is not necessarily regulated, not everybody has the same expectations on what they're going to get. So sometimes when people ask for natural wine, they are referring to certain flavors. Sometimes they prefer an unfined or an unfiltered wine, or they might expect that. So you could hand somebody a natural wine that's clear and not cloudy, right? And that just might not meet their expectation, even if it is made in that natural way from organic or biodynamic grapes and so forth. So it's really like learning what a natural wine really encompasses, and then learning how we can express in other ways when we do want to make sure that we're drinking natural wine, how we can ask for other styles of wine, I think will really help. So it should be lots of fun. So we'll think about this kind of philosophy of natural wine, right? And I think the philosophy of natural wine really fits into, a lot of the things that are become important in the world these days. I think that we look for, we consider, where our food's coming from. We consider where the cotton from our clothes are coming from, how things are being dyed, what types of chemicals are getting into, our water and things like that. And there really is no reason that we shouldn't also consider natural wine. I sometimes wish that we would come up with a little bit of a different term for natural wine, because like I said, it is sort of so genuinely like overarching. And also because I'm just like playing around with my I'm playing around with myself here on the screen. Sometimes I just look at myself and see how my hair is doing. So anyways, we're going to get past that though. So kind of understanding the concept of natural wine. And I hope and wish that maybe we'll come up with some terms in the future that I think really should promote and encompass more than just the concept of making wine naturally, but also more of what happens in the environment and in the vineyard as well. Because although these things are often thought to be included in natural wine, by law and by definition, they don't necessarily have to be. And I would like to see a little bit more clarity around the term and the subject, but we can't come to that clarity unless we begin to understand what the term means and how we can further clarify that term as well, right? So we have a couple of wines that we sent out through our partners at Ledoux. You're always welcome to open these and enjoy them with class, or we encourage you to save them for another time. We don't spend too much time on guided tasting during these classes because one, we know that not everybody can source the same wine based on where you are. A lot of the wines that we typically promote are finite, right? And there's a really good example of that in just a few moments, you know, and there's only a small amount produced. And when we're talking about natural wines, you know, can you produce natural wines on a really large scale commercial level, right? Can you produce organic food on a super large scale commercial level? Can you protect the environment, right, on a really large scale commercial level? So a lot of the natural wines are even more finite than some other styles of wine in the world. So for the first wine that we're discussing today, it's coming from Chile, from Leonardo Irazzo. And this is only 800 bottles of this wine made every vintage, you know, and that's not very much. And he was really inspired by this piece of land that he found in the Atata Valley, more in the southern wine growing regions of Chile. So we're really quite removed from Santiago and where a lot of the major wine producing regions of Chile are. And he was inspired by this plot of land that had these very old, ancient, ungrafted bush vines. And he purchased the property, he built his home there. And one of the reasons, I had some other pictures of Leonardo that I thought would be really fun because they showed a little bit more of the biodiversity of the vineyard. But I thought that this picture of him holding a child is so poignant because, you know, if you are a farmer and you are working on the land and you're raising your family on that land, what you're doing there is probably of great importance to you, right? And the chemicals and what your children will come into contact there. So I thought that this was a cool picture to kind of showcase that. So some of these vines are up to 170 years old. The La Ruptura is Muscat. It should be a little bit slightly cloudy. I've had this wine in a little bit, but it should be just a little slightly cloudy. It is unfined, it's unfiltered here. There's a few hours of skin contact to add a little bit of intensity and texture to the wine. It's fermented, of course, which is one of the sort of, I guess, guidelines of natural wine, not really rules, right? It is fermented with native yeast. So these are the yeast that are naturally forming on the skins in the vineyard before the grapes are picked, and then the yeast that occur naturally within the winery. The vines are farmed with organic and biodynamic practices as well. So this is just a really lovely, very well balanced Muscat. If you're familiar with the grape variety, it sometimes can be really intensely floral and musky and have a lot of musky with a K, not a T. We're going to talk about musty with a T later, right? So kind of musky, has a ton of aromatics to it. And sometimes it's fruit that's like a dull fruit cup, right? That's kind of like pineapple and oranges and pears, almost in syrup. Is this a sweet wine? No, but it has that intensity of fruit and floral characteristic to it. But in this case, it really has a lot of salinity that shines through, beautiful acidity, and a lot of tension. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about, you know, overall. If we do consider natural wines as a style, you know, how are we considering these natural wines? What do they have in common, right? Instead of just the philosophy, of course, something that they might have in common is a tension to the wines. It should be actually more flavors. Sometimes we do say that there's a little unpredictability to natural wines because the process used to stabilize them is usually much less, but we don't necessarily always need to look at that as a bad thing, right? Sometimes we like a little unpredictability, and if wine is, and we know it is, a living organism, then we should be willing to take those changes in stride when we do open a bottle of wine and let it tell us a story, right? So the second wine we sent out was the Foradori, and Elisabetta, she really is somebody who became sort of the poster child for the natural wine movement in Italy. She focuses on a pretty local grape within the region. It's been genetically linked to Syrah, maybe like Syrah, like an aunt or an uncle. It's not quite a parent variety, but it is a pretty ancient native grape to the region of Trentino, where she's from. She took over her father's winery, the estate, in 1985 when she was only 19 years old, and she immediately began to focus on the Teroldego grape variety. At the time, it was sort of an also ran grape. It had a lot of high yielding bunches. They were usually sold to local co-ops, or the vines were being uprooted in favor of, what we would call more sellable or commercially viable or economical grape varieties, right? But she really brought this grape back to life. She is the undisputed queen of Teroldego, no doubt. And as if this wasn't enough for her, in the 2000s, she began experimenting with organics and biodynamics in her vineyard. She really, she wasn't satisfied, even though she was already being considered the queen of Teroldego. She wanted more energy, and she wanted another dimension to her wines. And she started experimenting with biodynamic. She soon started experimenting with aging her wines in what we call tinajas, which are terracotta pot that are made in southern Spain. So they look very similar to amphora. The ones she uses tend to be a little taller and a little bit more narrow, but she's aging in these clay pots as well after tasting wines made from in amphora from another Italian winery, but this one was in the south, called Cros. We'll talk about them in a moment. This particular wine is fermented in a mix of stainless steel and used wood. We'll talk, of course, about the more traditional and accepted forms of fermenting and aging natural wine. Wood is often used, but most producers do eschew the use of new oak, which does add flavor. So in natural wine, we're not looking to add anything, and that would even include things like flavor that come specifically from oak. So also fermented with indigenous yeast, another one of the tenets of producing natural wine. She uses no sulfur in the winemaking process, just at bottling. All three of the wines that we're talking about today have sulfur added at bottling. So this is, I think, sulfur is one of the biggest debates of the natural wine movement at the moment. I think that the sulfur debate will eventually die down. It's really misunderstood how sulfur is used. Sulfur is an antibacterial and an antioxidant. So not only does it keep certain bacteria from forming in the wine, especially once it's being shipped and not necessarily at its own property anymore, but it also causes the wine to not oxidize. So we're going to talk about sulfur and the use of other food products in a few moments, and we might see some of those differences that it does cause when you use sulfur and when you don't. So sulfur has really been vilified, but it shouldn't, because it is a natural product that, when used appropriately, really can protect the wine. And people are going to feel very differently about sulfur and whether it should be used at all or whether it should be used for protecting the wine. I mean, I'm of the philosophy that when a winemaker puts so much heart and soul and intent into creating these products, using grapes from an organic or biodynamically farmed vineyard, making wine in a very small scale, artisanal way, right, at their winery, like, why wouldn't you want to protect that so that it comes to the consumer with the intention that you had for them to taste it at, right? So some people will disagree with me, and I'm happy to hear from you if you do. But Teroldego is really known for having a lot of both ripe and tart fruit flavors, so currant and cranberry, along with plum and cherry. It can be earthy and more on the fennel side. It has smoke. Now, because natural wines are typically made without any additional sulfur, all wines, for the most part, always have sulfur in them because it's also a natural byproduct of fermentation. So I usually, though, they have very little added sulfur or sulfites. or none, right? So natural wines can, when we say like kind of overall, if we're talking about a style, they can often be less fruit forward because that sulfur help protect that really like fruit forward expression that you get from the wine, right? A lot of these natural wines oftentimes are have slightly more oxidative or oxidative flavor to them as well, a little bit more, straw or honey characteristics, right? Maybe we talk about like a slight nuttiness to the wine, something like that, because of that more minimal use of sulfur. But we do still want fruit. And I think most natural wines should still encompass a lot of that freshness to them as well. So as it happens, we did run out of the Tyrol to go. So I know that our partners sent out, so everybody has the Arazo from Etata, the Muscat, some people have the Foradori, and some people have the Cruz Wine Company Monkey Jacket. This is a red blend coming from the North Coast. Now, Michael Cruz is not always considered to be like one of the natural winemakers of California, but I think one of the things that's really missing from kind of the natural wine conversation is using grape varieties that are available to you, right? So I think that oftentimes we forget a little bit about the environmental aspect of why we should also be promoting natural wines. And Michael Cruz is using a lot of these, not indigenous grape varieties, because none of the grapes that we use to make wine really in California are native to the United States, really, right? So they were all brought here. But there's a lot of older planted vineyards in California that still have sort of field blends of these sort of mixed black grapes that might have been planted even before Prohibition. So this is a blend primarily of Valdigues with Carignan, another 14% of other mixed black field blend red grapes, Petit Syrah, Tannat, Saint Laurent, and Pinot Noir. The blend does change year to year so that he can take advantage of the best fruit of that vintage and of that season. We're also using native yeast, very light sulfurs, just before bottling, aged in older French oak, so we're not adding that flavor there. He really wants to produce these like fresh sort of glue, which is a style that we see a lot in natural wines, wines that are meant to be enjoyed in weather like California. So he really prides himself on producing essentially like California wines, as he likes to call them. So if you have any of these wines open, as always, I would love to hear any of your opinions. So to understand natural wines, we have to have an understanding of what makes them natural as opposed to any other style of wine, right? And one of the big issues about the term or concept of natural wine that some people don't enjoy is that calling one wine a natural wine immediately infers that any other wine is unnatural, right? And that's not absolutely necessarily true. It can be, because wine can be made with a lot of additives, addition, or we can take things away. But if we don't understand the kind of general overarching concept of winemaking, then we probably want to really understand that difference and the importance of natural wine versus what we would call like more conventionally farmed grapes or conventionally made wine, right? So we know the basic formula for fermentation. And so I'm just going to backtrack a second here. I'm going to backtrack. I feel like there's going to be a lot of, there's was so much to research and to cover for this. And, Ryan, my colleague, if you guys don't know him, he did this class, I want to say probably almost a year ago. And he actually put together the majority of this slideshow. And it was just so fantastic that I wanted to use it again because he did such a great job. But there's so much to research and so many different viewpoints about natural wine that, I mean, there's just like a million things in my head right now. So I'll probably stop a lot and be like, oh, and by the way, and I apologize, and I hope that you'll be able to follow that concept, right? So let's just talk about winemaking here. So sugar plus yeast equal alcohol and carbon dioxide. An important thing to understand is that sometimes wines in general, and not just natural wines, can have a little sprit to them, right? And we're not talking about purposeful styles of sparkling wine like champagne or cava, French Quarter, Prosecco, or Pet Nat, right? Sometimes still wines have a little spritziness to them. And sometimes this is a complaint that I hear about some natural wines. Well, carbon dioxide is a natural byproduct of fermentation. And when wines are not adulterated and they're bottled, sometimes a little bit of that carbon dioxide remains, even when the wine is bottled. So you get a little bit of that spritz right on the palate when you might first open a bottle of white or red wine that has a little bit of that to it. It doesn't mean that anything has gone bad with the wine. It just means that not all of that carbon dioxide that was there from the winemaking has necessarily filtered out of the wine, right? The other thing that's produced from sugar and yeast, where did the sugar come from? It comes from ripe grapes. You cannot make wine from unripe grapes that do not have sugar. So this is why we're looking in the vineyard for the best practices to pick the grapes at their ripest expression, but most balanced expression, right? And one of the biggest issues is with farming, we are farming all types of agricultural crops in areas that aren't necessarily suited to maintaining that type of agriculture, right? And so we are not making the perfect grapes or crops, and therefore we have to make a lot of adjustments in the winery to make those wines palatable. So that's a really big issue. So we have to start with ripe grapes that have accumulated enough sugar that the flavors of the grape have ripened. So what we're accustomed to with wine, right? We want to make sure that there's enough sugar in the grape and in the resulting juice after we crush those grapes, that the yeast can do their job and turn that sugar into alcohol, right? So this is the important thing. So why are wines dry with alcohol, but grape juice is sweet with no alcohol? Because sugar being eaten by yeast is what turned it into wine, right? So we understand this concept. We also want to make sure when we pick these grapes, one, we're picking them in the fall typically. Of course, depending on where you are in which hemisphere you're in, we're doing that at different times of year, but we're picking them in the fall, right? When we're going into more variable weather. So it's a balance between getting these grapes ripe enough and then picking them in time before the variable weather comes, right? And is a really hard thing for some winemakers in some parts of the world to do. And places like California might be a little bit easier than somewhere like Burgundy to get your grape at the optimal ripeness without worrying about a hailstorm or a rainstorm coming in, right? So we want to pick it at the optimal ripeness. We also want to make sure that that grape has still kept enough acidity that the wine is pleasing to drink, because acidity is one of the most important aspects of wine, because it's what makes the wine refreshing on the palate, right? So we know how wine is made. When it seems like this is how wine is made, all wine should be natural, right? When you think, well, wow, if sugar and yeast equal alcohol and carbon dioxide, then why are all wines natural? Because every grape has yeast on it. Yeast is on everything, everywhere. So this is why you don't need to add yeast to your wine when you bring it into the winery. It's also why you have to get your grapes into the winery as soon as possible. Because if you have that fermentation starting outside of the winery, let's say in crates that are hanging out in the hot sun in the vineyard, you are inviting more opportunity for bacterial spoilage into your wines, right? And now if we're going to make a natural wine and we're not going to make any corrections on those types of spoilage, we need to make sure we're working as clean as possible. So we pick these grapes. We don't want them to be injured or hurt. It's more sensitive to the grape to pick by hand. That's also one of the things we talk about a lot with natural winemaking. We've taken these grapes from Lutte Raisonné, right? The reasonable site, or organic or biodynamic vineyards where we're being stewards of the land, right? Now we're getting them into the winery. So this is where we start to see the real concept. Did I hear a question? And you guys can interrupt me at any time. Too. So I kind of forgot. So I haven't done a virtual class in a while. So I kind of forgot to give you the spiel. My name's Amber. Interrupt me at any time. Please use the chat box to talk to each other or ask questions or talk about what you're drinking. Or since we're going to be talking about wine regions, which everybody loves to go to, if you've been to any of these regions, please share your experience with the group. It really makes it really fun when we get to engage with each other in our wine community. So now we've gotten these grapes into the winery, and this is really at the point that we really begin to start talking about the concept of natural wine, right? Nothing added and nothing taken away. So in more conventional winemaking, sulfur is added immediately once the wines get into the winery. This is to prevent the juice from oxidizing. So if it's a white wine, if it begins to oxidize, it will be a little bit browner than if we don't add any sulfur at all. So this is something we see in natural wine. Sometimes they're a little bit more on the slightly less clear side, right? They're not necessarily always as bright as wines that are made with sulfur, when wines are made without sulfur. You see this in fruit too. If you were to take apricots and have traditionally sulfured apricots, which are around can be up to 3,500 parts per million of sulfites in those apricots, they'll be a lot brighter than apricots that are dried without the use of sulfur. But the flavor in the apricots made without the use of sulfur should actually be a little bit better, right? So we have our grapes in the winery in conventional winemaking. We add sulfur right away. We will oftentimes add a cultured or conventional yeast to ensure that the fermentation starts quickly and finishes rapidly. And when you add a cultured or laboratory yeast, essentially what happens is it tends to take over any other type of yeast that you might have in that juice as well. So yeast really, when it's natural, is a big part of the terroir of a wine, right? The terroir of what's coming out of the vineyard, and even the terroir of the winery itself. Now, in natural winemaking, we tend to not fine or filter like we typically would in more conventional winemaking, especially if we haven't done as good of a job ensuring that we have clean and ripe grapes as well. And then we usually will hit that wine again. In conventional winemaking, we might use sulfur at many different parts of the winemaking process and then add it to bottling as well. So this really stabilizes the wine. But when we add too much sulfur, we go too far, right? And we might inhibit some of the natural flavors. We've killed the natural yeast that might contribute to some of the concept of the terroir of the wine. And then we ship that wine around the world. So we're going to come back and talk. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so we'll come back. Now, climate, of course, is something that we always consider in winemaking. Now, natural wines tend to usually be slightly lower in alcohol than some types of conventionally made wine. So this is it, and again, some of these are kind of blanket statements, and I don't necessarily want them to be, but because there's just so many different viewpoints, we'll just do the best that we can. But, climate usually, and when we have a warmer climate, we get riper grapes. That equals more sugar in the grape, and we have more resulting alcohol in the wine. Now, natural wines are oftentimes coming from or spearheaded in these smaller, more rural farming communities. The natural wine movement we consider really started in France, even though Tony Couturier was making wine in the 1970s, just like Marcel Lapierre was in Beaujolais. And so we consider this concept of climate and how it affects the resulting wine, right? Warmer climates, riper grapes, more sugar, not necessarily, and which leads to more alcohol in the wine, not necessarily more sugar. Cooler climates, usually lower alcohol. They're often more food-friendly wines because they're less bombastic on the palate, right? And they tend to have higher acidity, which we really enjoy in wine a lot as well. We think about that concept of old world versus new world. Natural wines can be made anywhere, right? As I mentioned, it's a philosophy, not just a style. We can make those wines anywhere we really would like, that we think that responsible viticulture can be sustained, right? So does that mean maybe some of the bigger, larger, drier valleys where miles of grapes are planted and we're using machine harvesting and irrigation? Maybe not so much in those areas, right? So we talk about the old world versus the new world. The old world, I heard this described recently and I really enjoyed it. And somebody said that in the old world, the main differences in terms of the climate is that in the old world, that the grapes cling to the warmer fringes of a cold continent, right? So we tend to plant the grapes in the warmer areas of Europe. And in the New World, the grapes cling to the cool fringes of a warm continent. So we plant grapes in the cooler areas of these essentially warmer countries and warmer climates, right? The cooler parts of California along the coast where they have that influence, that cooling breeze of the Pacific Ocean. As we move into places like South Africa and Australia, we're planting further south, where we're actually taking effect of the cooling that you get in the Southern Hemisphere, the further south that you go. Interrupt me if you have questions. Okay, so I jumped ahead of myself a little bit and I answered some of these questions, but we'll just take a moment to go through. So, what is natural wine? So we'll talk about the kind of overarching philosophy that we understand. Wine without pesticides, chemicals, and other additives is what I heard earlier. Nothing added and nothing taken away. Can you take something away from wine? Yes, you can. We'll talk about that. So the natural wine movement, although, unnatural wine or more conventional wine, as you would call it, is a pretty new phenomenon. It's, we started using mechanization actually in the later 1800s, but we didn't really see a lot of really commercial conventional winemaking until after World War II. So we'll talk about that. So in the 1960s, we had winemakers from Beaujolais, and they were inspired by the teachings of a man named Jules Chauvet. And Jules Chauvet was, actually, he was a wine importer. But he was also a scientist, and he started talking to his neighbor in Morgon. You'll see that all of these labels here on the right-hand side share the same appellation in Beaujolais, which is Morgon. He started talking to his neighbor, Marcel Lapierre, and they became very interested in trying to make Beaujolais in a way that was not common and during this time. And so, they're starting in like the late 1960s, early 1970s. And at this time, this really sort of easy to make style of Beaujolais was rampant. We were using one single type of cultured yeast to kind of made all the Beaujolais taste the same. This really like banana-y characteristic they had to it. The grapes were farmed very conventionally. They had lost a lot of the overarching, physiology of the vineyards themselves. Sorry, I'm not forgetting the word that I want to use, but the integrated agriculture, right, of these particular vineyards. They were picking the grapes quite early, and then they were chaptalizing the wine juice. And chaptalizing is when you add sugar to the fermenting wine juice, not to increase the sugar level of the wine, but to increase the finished alcohol of the wine. So they were picking the grapes a little bit too early. The flavors were a little bit underripe. They might have been slightly greener. They were chaptalizing the wine to get the alcohol up. And Marcel Lapierre especially, said, I want to go back to the flavors of the wine that I tasted when wine was made by my parents and my grandparents. So this sort of gang of four, who were really championed by an American importer named Kermit Lynch, came to really espouse this new movement of natural wine. And they began picking riper grapes. They began using better farming practices in the vineyard. They stopped chaptalizing their wine, and they started experimenting with making wine without added yeast and without added sulfur as well. So they really went backwards from a lot of the sort of commercial agriculture that had become rampant after the end of World War II, when there was a lot of chemicals available for agriculture. And post World War II, we were also looking to feed a growing population. A lot of these wine regions, like everything, nothing just happens for one reason, right? We have a lot of excess chemicals after World War II. We have a declining workforce in a lot of the more rural areas of these winemaking regions. So winemakers that wanted to keep going were looking for ways to more easily mechanize their work in the vineyard because they didn't have people to work there, and also their work in the winery, right? So of course, all of these things come to a head. And oftentimes we think of natural wine as being glue wine. A lot of people will say like natural wine does not age, but that really is it's just simply not true. There's a lot of very ageable natural wine, but I think one of the the greatest things about enjoying natural wine is that you don't necessarily have to know a ton about the world of wine, right? So it can be sort of an easy to understand concept if you're getting into the world of wine, even though we're taking it really deep in this class, right? But if you don't know the best vineyards of Burgundy, if you don't know the greatest chateaus of Bordeaux, right? If you don't understand the history of wine in South Africa and what the better regions are and who the up and coming winemakers are there, you can drink these styles of wine. They can often be inexpensive, especially if you're drinking them somewhere like France. A lot of these natural wines do come from France. You're not paying for these, these import and export taxes and all of those things like that. So it's like to go to a wine bar and to get a bottle of wine for 25, 35, 45 euro and enjoy that with the food, I think can be really appealing. So one of those things, right? So the basic criteria that is generally accepted by most natural wine producers and organizations, although the term itself is not actually regulated, are that the grapes are grown organically or biodynamically, and that can be with or without certification. Can you employ organic and biodynamic practices without paying to be certified by whichever governing body you want to be certified for? Yes, you can. There are many producers who choose not to pay for that certification, but do farm in these ways. We generally look for dry farms or low yielding vineyards. The grapes should be hand-picked. In some regions, this is already mandatory. Oftentimes in Beaujolais, you have to hand-pick your grape. You're not adding sugar, so you're not looking to chaptalize your wine. We're not adding cultured yeast. We're not adding foreign bacteria or enzyme to the wine. We're not adjusting acidity. The acidity can be adjusted. You can add different types of acidity, tartaric acidity, etc., to the wine to bolster that acid. Oftentimes, New World wines made on a commercial level, especially for reds, are acidified. So during the winemaking process, we've gotten used to a lot of really like ripe fruit flavors in wine. And as we develop these flavors, the acidity is going down in the vineyard. So oftentimes we're making these wines in order for it to have that freshness. We have to acidify the wine. We're not making, you can also take acidity away. You can also de-acidify a wine as well. You might have to do this if you're not working with the best vineyard practices and your grapes are underripe, right? You cannot add additives for color, mouthfeel, minerality, and so forth. Things like mega purple, which you hear about in California, which is essentially concentrated grape concentrate that you can actually add to the wine to bolster the color, to bolster the mouthfeel, to bolster the fruitiness of the wine. And these things are all legal. In between the US and the EU, depending on where you're at, there's more than 75 to like 85 additives that can legally be added to wine, not natural wine, but wine in general, conventional wine, without being listed on the label. So there really is quite a bit. Most of these are naturally derived things, but they're not being true to the nature necessarily of the grape, right? We're not looking for external flavor additives, things like flavor derived to Safeway and you're getting a $9 bottle of oaky Chardonnay from the bottom shelf. That's not a wine that was made with new oak barrel. It's just simply that wine is too inexpensive to bear the cost of aging your wine in a new oak barrel, which is quite expensive. So producers will achieve this oak flavor in other ways. It's regulated in some countries, but not in others like the United States. So we talk about minimal or no fining or filtration. Sometimes, I think one of the other difficult things about natural wine is we can't really always be so dogmatic, right? I mean, it's really easy for somebody like me to sit here and say, I only want to drink natural wine because that's the best thing for me. And if I'm following that philosophy for everything I'm ingesting in my life, I think that that's great, right? But the reality of life is that you do the best that you can and understand that sometimes you have to get that slice of pizza from the corner, right? Sometimes you need to heat up a cup of ramen at like 2 o'clock in the morning. It just doesn't always, unfortunately, fit in with the lifestyle that we live, especially depending on where you are. If you're in New York City like me, that we can always follow dogmatically some of these best practices. So who would I be to sit here and tell a producer who, as I mentioned before, has farmed correctly, had made their wine well, had not made any additive, but maybe there was a really bad year of some sort of bacteria that got into the winery or into the cellar? Who am I to tell them that now they can't lightly filter that wine so that they can still sell it and have an economically viable vintage, right? I don't really think that I have or would want to take on a responsibility like that. So minimal or no fining or filtration, again, overall. No heavy manipulation like micro oxygenation. Michel Roland is a huge supporter of micro oxygenation. All of the wineries that he consults for probably do this. Micro oxygenation, essentially it's machinery that send little tiny oxygen bubbles up through the wine. So this helps the wine soften faster, be ready to drink earlier, especially if it's a very tannic grape variety, something like Tannat or Cabernet Sauvignon. And oftentimes micro-oxygenation is used in conjunction with some sort of oak flavoring. So rather than actually having to take the time to mature your wine in oak barrels, you can integrate that oak flavor quickly with like an oak tea bag, right? It's like a powdered oak that's inside a tea bag that you dip into the wine vat, and then you let that micro oxygenation incorporate that flavor a lot faster than aging your wine in oak. We don't use things like reverse osmosis or spinning cone. These are tools that are used oftentimes to de-alcoholize a wine. And we're going to go on a lot of tangents here because I think it's just necessary to understand it. But if you are a major grocery store chain, something that has grocery stores all over Europe or all over the United States, and you have your own wine brand that you sell, you are not going to want to change the label every year, right? You're not going to want to pay somebody. You might change the vintage. You might not. You might make a non-vintage wine for your house supermarket wine, right? And you're not going to want to change the alcohol level every year. So these larger producers are going to adjust that alcohol level as opposed to changing for these supermarkets the label every year, if that makes sense, right? Because it's just not viable for them, and I don't think that they probably think about the concept of how wine should be made in that style, that maybe we shouldn't be using reverse osmosis and spinning cone to remove some of the alcohol from our wine, right? So what have we done? We let our grapes ripen too long. We had to hit it with sulfur when it came into the winery. They've been on the vine for so long. Who knows what else is on those grapes by now, right? We hit it with sulfur to kill the natural yeast. We add yeast. We acidify the wine. We put it through reverse osmosis to remove a little bit of alcohol. We put it in the tank with micro oxygenation and an oak tea bag. And then we hit it with some sulfur again and we bottle it, right? It doesn't sound like a very romantic view of winemaking, but that's how a lot of conventional wines are made. So natural wine, we're not looking to do any of those things. Very minimal or no added sulfite. And typically, as we mentioned before, we're talking about organic, biodynamic, or reasonably farmed vineyards that we should be purchasing these grapes from. And I think that that's a hard thing, that natural wine doesn't always immediately and transparently embrace organic and biodynamic viticulture. And I'd like to see that be a really important tenet of what they're doing here. How do we order natural wine? Well, don't just look for a natural wine. Let's talk about some of the experiences of the flavors that you might be looking for. Maybe what you're going to enjoy with food with that wine. Maybe you love a specific grape variety or region, because these natural wines really are made everywhere. So in 2020, in France, they have attempted to regulate some of these terms of natural wine. So it's headed up by a vintner in the Loire Valley named Jacques Carrier. He had the existing European regulation prohibit the term natural wine on labels. So this new, this sort of attempt, and not just attempt, but like at the first attempt at kind of classifying how natural wine should be made in a country. In France, we see this label Vin Méthode Nature. Now there's two versions of this label, one that would just be the circle with the Vin Méthode Nature, and then one that also says sans sulfite ajouté. So we're talking about a wine made without any added sulfites in this particular wine. In order to have this label on your wine, your grapes must be handpicked, and they must come from certified organic vines and made with indigenous yeast. So even if you're an organic vineyard, but you're not certified, your grape would not be eligible for this classification. We're not using any of those really heavy machineries within the winery to make any adjustments to our wine. You can add up to 30 milligrams per liter of sulfites. In that case, you would not see this term down here saying that no sulfites are added, which is why we have the two logos. And we are expecting probably by now, maybe 100 French wine brands or even more actually using this, this seal of approval or this label on their bottle of wine as well. It's a pretty cool thing when you see. So when we can talk about sulfites, you know, because I think it's important when we get to the concept of organic and biodynamic wine that we're going to be talking about. You know, sulfites, as I mentioned, they do protect the wine. If I were a winemaker, I would probably want to use a the most minimal amount of sulfites that I could, right, to protect my wine so that it comes to the consumer with the integrity that was intended. And so one of the things I think, again, about natural wine is we can use it as a code word to signify to the consumer that wherever that wine is coming from whichever grapes it is made for, they were made within that region with the minimum possible intervention, right? And sometimes, depending on where you are or what the condition of that vintage were, sometimes that minimal possible intervention might be adding some sulfite, right? It might be doing some sort of light filtration to the wine, if that makes sense. So organic, we have two categories in the US. We have wine that is organic and wine made from organic grape. They are two separate categories. It's more common that you're going to see wine made from organic grapes. The reason is for the organic wine certification from the USDA, the grapes have to be grown without synthetic fertilizers, the concept pretty much of organics, right? No synthetic work in the vineyard, no synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, right? All ingredients, including yeast, must be certified organic if you are adding yeast, which you can in organic wine. But for USDA certified organic wines, no sulfite can be added. Some that occur naturally and of course are in the wine may be there, but you may not add any additional sulfite. So it's much less common that you do see this term. You'll more often see wine that is made with organically grown grapes. You'll see that on the label. Any additional ingredients used in winemaking do not need to be organic. Sulfites have to be limited to under 100 parts per million or less. It doesn't carry the USDA's organic seal. And it's also important to know that just seeing made with organically grown grapes on a wine label does not mean that it's a natural wine, because they can still use a lot of more unnatural wine techniques in the winery to make these wines, which is a shame if you spend the money and take all of these beautiful, healthy, organic or biodynamic grapes and then make it in a way that masks the work that went into that vineyard, right? In 2012, the EU began to allow organic wine on labels versus previously made from organic grapes. USDA wines, as we mentioned, have virtually no sulfite, only what is actually created during the fermentation. EU counterparts for organic wines can contain up to 100 parts per million of sulfite, just like the USDA certified organic wines. And in Canada, we see some of these designations as well. 100% organic, also certified organic grapes, no added sulfite. Organic, we see 95% certified organic grapes and very low level of sulfite. And then also we have the designation made with organic grapes, unofficial labeling for wine with 70% minimum organic grapes. And these wines can also contain some added sulfites. So then we have the concept of biodynamics, right? And biodynamics goes back nearly a century. The governing a practice of the vineyard itself. Unlike organics, the intent to biodynamics did not change between the countries. So it was introduced during a lecture from Rudolf Steiner of Austria in 1924. He did a lecture in Germany on organic agriculture, biodynamic agriculture, not just for viticulture. It considers the farm as an entire living organism. One of the things that's important in natural winemaking, biodynamics, is we encourage the biodiversity. That's the word I was trying to think of earlier. We really don't want to have these monocultures, right? We want to have a polyculture working self-sustainable farm. They usually will produce their own animal manure and compost, which is why often these biodynamic farms that you see do encompass, livestock, other types of gardens. It follows the lunar calendar, naturally occurring cycles like moon phases that tell when's the best time to harvest, when you should taste wine, when you should do your pruning. And, and it does make sense because we know that the gravitational pull of the moon does affect things here on Earth, and it can possibly affect the flow of the sap within the vine, which is why we think of when to pick and when to prune as important to time with the moon cycles in the season. Several of you that are on the call know my partner Artem, who is Russian, and his mother once told me when I was going to get a haircut during a waning moon that it's biodynamic. You never get your hair cut during a waning moon if you want your hair to grow well. So ever since then, I try to time my haircuts during a waxing moon cycle. This is maybe why sometimes people refer to things like biodynamics as witchcraft, but it can't really hurt, right? Oftentimes we look at these sort of 4 different ideas of days as when to harvest, when to taste wine, when to prune, when to water, and when to leave the vineyard untouched. And essentially, Alice Firing, who is a wine writer, really wrote a lot of lovely books on natural wine of the country of Georgia, and she has a great blog called The Firing Line. I really love the way she sums up biodynamics. She said that biodynamics are homeopathic organics based on 9 preparations in the vineyard: animal, mineral, and vegetal, time to the seasons, the stars, and the moon. I hope we're doing okay, guys. Moving right along. We don't have a lot of time left, but we don't have too much left to go through. And I'm going to send out these slides too, because, I don't think it's interesting enough to go through every single notation on the different preparations for biodynamics, but I think it's fun to go through them quickly and see what we use in the vineyard for these preparations during biodynamics. So preparation 500, 501, and 508 are field spray preparation. Usually people are exposed to the concept of biodynamic through preparation 500, where you take the manure from a lactating cow and you place that inside of a cow horn and you bury that over the winter. So the concept is that it stimulates the microbial life and encourages root growth. Usually we apply it in both the spring and in the fall. The timing of the day is really important. When the soil was worked is important as well. When I worked at Brooks Wines, we applied silica during the ripening. It encourages photosynthesis and ripening. We got up at 4 a.m. and we started mixing the silica. It had to be stirred for over an hour, and then we sprayed it on the vine and the leaves on the sunrise. And so this is to, as I mentioned, encourage that photosynthesis and more ripening of the grapes themselves. You'll see horsetail plant to fight fungal instruction. And then you have your compost preparations as well. A lot of the vegetal preparations that you'll see, things that will stabilize nitrogen, which is very important for both the growth of the grapevine and making of wine. We have yarrow flowers aiding in the absorption of nutrients, oftentimes stuffed into a deer bladder. Others might be made into a tea and sprayed onto the vines themselves or sprayed onto the soil as well. So there's a lot of these different natural, as I mentioned, and homeopathic methods that we really see to treat the vineyard. So here you can see the cow horn being stuffed with the manure of a lactating cow and buried. I would assume this looks like it's being done in the fall as opposed to the spring. Just I would say that based on the greenness of the grass, but I'm not 100% certain. Demeter is our main biodynamic certification that we see. It is the first ecological label for organically produced foods as well. You do not only see it for wine. It's an international certification that represents 45 countries, and the products need to meet the international standards for both the production and the processing of the product. Biodynamic wine does permit sulfites. So I think that is one big difference from a lot of the organic certifications, is that biodynamic wine does actually permit the use of sulfites in both food and in the winery as well. I hope everybody's doing all right. So just some of the labels that you might see for natural, sustainable, biodynamic, organic agriculture and wine. So again, not just for viticulture. And also there's a really important one called B Corp as well, which is a certification for a kind of holistic company that really looks for the care of the environment, their products, but also the people that work for them. And we can talk. I really could have done a 0 slide, and we could have talked only about the philosophy of like natural winemaking and social sustainability, and why it's so hard when this is an unregulated term, because there are conventional wineries who make a natural wine cuvee, and it is made naturally, right? They probably purchase biodynamic grapes and they make it that way in the winery. But when it's a cuvee out of their entire production, I don't know that I would say that upholds the tenets and the philosophy of natural winemaking, right? You might agree or you might not agree. I'm really curious in a few moments to hear any of your perspective on this. I think that another part that's not often discussed with natural wines and wine in general is social sustainability, how the winery or the vineyard are impacting the economic health of the region that they're located in, the region, the state, the city, the country, right? Are you ensuring that you have full-time workers? Are you paying a living wage? These are all really important, factors to consider. And also, in making a natural wine dogmatically, meaning we always even make a natural wine with a recipe, right? Natural wine wanted to move away from the kind of the recipe of winemaking. But if we just move into a new recipe and we don't consider the needs of the vineyards, the growers, if you choose to not make wine for a year because you have to treat something in some way, does that help the overall health of the community, right? If you're not going to pay your growers for their grapes, if you're not going to be able to hire your staff for a full year of work because you just don't want to filter your wine. So this might be really contentious for a lot of people. And I didn't want to bring too much of my opinion into it, but I think it's, it just brings up the idea that there's a lot to consider with the concept of both conventional and natural winemaking. And again, mostly how we use these terms. So we'll just talk about a few of our favorite natural wine producers. They're everywhere. A philosophy, not a style. I keep repeating it because it bears repeating, right? Leclerc, Briand, Vouet, and Sorbet, Lec Lepar, even Louis Roederer farm. They are a bigger winery. They do purchase grapes, but they farm 85% of their own vineyards that they own, and they are biodynamic. Tarlant, the Loire Valley is really well known for the movement of natural wine producers. And I think if you're a natural wine producer, excuse me, a biodynamic or organic grape grower in the Loire Valley or in Champagne, you can't really use the excuse that you can't farm organically or biodynamically in some places, right? Because Champagne, Loire are some of the coolest and most unpredictable regions for weather in France, along with somewhere like Burgundy, Barou, La Flève, Romani-Conti, the most expensive Pinot Noir in the entire world. It's farmed biodynamically. Chandon de Briey, Prieur Roche, Ganavat and Auvernois coming from the Jura. A lot of people mistakenly think that all Jura wines are natural, and that's not true. I think maybe it comes because natural wines sometimes have a little bit more of that oxidative character to them because of that lower use of sulfur, and that is a stylistic choice oftentimes of the Jura in that region. Zind Umbrecht, Weinbach, the Brutal label coming from winemakers like Christian Binner and Alsace. We have the Rhone Valley, Dardenne Rebot, August Clapp, Bramignon in the south, Pauvet, Gauby, Mas Julien, Matassa, Abatucci coming from Corsica, a really fantastic natural wine producer, also focused on really making sure that we keep a lot of those sort of grape varieties that are not necessarily indigenous, but have really become naturalized in Corsica. All of the grape varieties were brought here from Spain, from France, from Italy, being in this really kind of strategic spot in the Mediterranean. Pontet Canet, Chateau Lepi, and Bordeaux is quickly becoming one of the more environmentally conscious regions in France as well, which should be a whole nother topic, but we'll probably cover that in our Bordeaux classes coming up soon. We have producers like Gravner, Radicon, Princic in Italy, located in Friuli. These are producers that are really well known for their natural wine styles, especially somebody like Gravner, who was a very traditional white wine maker, very conventional, really clean, really oak styles of wine. He went to Georgia and was so inspired by the styles of wine that they were making there that he switched his entire philosophy and way of winemaking, which is pretty amazing. For Idori, as we talked about earlier, Alois Lagardère doing a lot of Pinot Grigio. In Trentino, we have them in Piedmont, in Tuscany, Soldera, Le Macchioli, some of the most well-known Brunello and Super Tuscan producers. Frank Cornelissen in Sicily, Ariana Occhipinti and her uncle coming from the Coast Winery, really influential in this area. Movia, Berhas, Dekar. In Croatia, Bura, we have a lot of natural winemakers in Greece, right? They said I'll send this all out, so I don't want to just like shout out winemakers at you, but there's a lot of really fantastic winemakers, and their style do run from these little slightly more like wild kind of funkier flavors to really clean natural winemaking. It is possible to definitely do both, and you see the wine really run the spectrum. And we talk about oftentimes, it's so important to build that relationship with somebody at a winery or at a wine bar that come to know a little bit about your palate and can recommend things that fit for your price range, for your palate, and then more when you're ready to expand as well. California, Oregon, Washington, New York all have some fantastic natural producers working with the kind of local grapes that have been in the region for a really long time, working with a lot of local organizations. In Washington and Oregon, there are also certification for salmon safe, making sure that any of the waterways that are located close to your property are being kept clean and safe for salmon. I'm from Washington, so that's a really big point of interest for us and importance. The Swartland independent producers in South Africa, even in Australia, Hinsky, a really, really well-known wine producer, Ben Haynes, Small Fry, Ochota. Unfortunately, these are the Ochota barrels wine, and he really wanted to make clean, approachable, natural wines, but he did pass away recently, I want to say within the last year or 2 years. Testalonga, Craven Wines, everywhere, right? And then one of the other great things you can really consider is looking for the distributors who are known for sourcing natural wines. And so tomorrow, when I send up a follow-up with this recording, I'm going to send some link to some great podcasts and some interesting articles on natural wine and debates on natural wine. But, we always say, look at who's importing your wine, because many importers bring in wine from multiple countries, right? So that's an important thing. And usually the importer brings in a style of wine that suits their overall philosophy and their overall palate. So if you start turning your bottle of wine over and noticing, wow, every time I have a wine from the importer, Neil Rosenthal, I love it. You'll probably be willing to try either grape varieties or maybe wine regions or producers that you're not familiar with if you have one of these seals of approval, right? Kermit Lynch, Neil Rosenthal, Louis Dresner, his son, Jules Dresner, has a big part in the company now. And he said something really funny on a podcast talking about, like natural wine fairs, like raw wine, and you see all these guys like standing out front wearing t-shirts that say like sulfite kill on them, but they're out there chain smoking cigarettes. So, again, let's look at the overall philosophy. There's a lot of fantastic wine bars that focus on natural wines, although Cork Buzz is not one of them that only focuses on natural wines. I often tell people that many of the wines, really most of the wines on our list follow a lot of the philosophies that we've discussed today: organic, biodynamic, Loot Raisonné, natural winemaking, because these practices do make better wine. So a lot of the producers that we love, even if they're not certified or if they don't always make wine exactly in this style, really will fit that bill. But there are some great wine bars here in New York. Racine, 10 Bells, Skin Contact, Wild Air, The Four Horsemen, Company du Vin So Natural as well can be a really fantastic place to go and explore more natural wines. Again, look at the philosophy, not just the style, and consider, what other style that you're really looking to drink for that evening. Maybe it is a specific region where you're looking for a natural producer. Maybe it is a grape variety and so forth. Thank you guys, that was a lot. I want to hear somebody's opinion about everything that you just learned, and if you have a rebuttal, I would love to hear it.
Hey Amber, it's Lynn. Thank you for
Hi.
the shout out at the beginning. I was in the other room pouring some wine, so I couldn't answer you. I have found in general, and I haven't tasted a lot of natural wine, but it has, and I like it fine, but it tends to have a different flavor profile than unnatural wine, which is not really a good word for the rest of the wine, but it's a different, to me, it's a different wine completely than drinking the typical wine that you drink.
Yes, I understand, and I do agree. So there's a couple of reasons that people say sort of lead to this natural wine palate. One of the reasons I don't always like the term natural wine is because I feel like sometimes winemakers that just haven't made a good wine have passed it off by explaining it that way. Well, it's a natural wine, so it's going to be a little like that. Well, I'm like, well, if Chandon de Brie and Ravenel can make crystalline, beautiful styles of natural wine, probably somebody else can do it too, right? But the truth is that when we're not using commercial yeast, not all yeast are super clean. So you have a little bit of what we kind of call sometimes a little bit of this funkiness, slightly more earthy, a little more mushroomy. Usually natural wines are not as fruit forward as more really conventional wines, right? And that's because of that oxidation through the use of lower sulfur. And so that could be a little bit more of a nuttiness. It could be a more dried fruit profile. We tend to have more herbal flavors in these natural wines. And sometimes you do get this kind of like wild, almost yeastiness from the use of these natural yeasts. So sometimes you
That's
get a
an
little bit of
excellent,
character.
the way you just described it is exactly my experience. By the way, really fun fact that DRC is biodynamic. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yes, they are. Yeah, they are. I don't know if I would necessarily go in the direction of being, are they a total natural winemaker? Because they do obviously use new oak on their wine, but they are making very conscientious wine, right? And so when we think about being so dogmatic about the term natural wine, when we have producers that are being so conscientious, employ a lot of people in Burgundy, which is a very rural community, maybe sometimes those things take precedent over not being a natural winemaker because you're using new oak to add flavor to your wine. So, but like everybody can have their own opinion on that, I think. Yeah, but natural wine can be really fun. And I think looking at getting back to a place where we are looking for less manipulation and more transparency in everything that we buy and everything that we choose to ingest, whether it be food or medication or wine or other types of beverages, is something that we should continue to strive for. So, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question in terms of the use of stainless steel tanks versus cement tanks.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what your opinion is, or your experience in terms of the impact on the difference using those different types of tanks with natural wines.
So there is a little bit of a philosophy, depending on which natural winemaker that you talk to, that temperature controlled stainless steel is an intervention, right? So some natural winemakers, again, like I know that people are I'm trying to be really careful because I know that everybody has a little bit of their own opinion, and I'm not trying to disparage anybody else.
I'm asking your opinion.
But thank you. But wine is an intervention. Winemaking is an intervention, regardless of how you want to make it. Like grapes don't want to become wine. They'd much rather become fruit juice or vinegar, and so you have to make, again, the minimal intervention that you can to still make good wine, right? And by making good wine, good flavors, drinkability to it, sound. And there are producers that think, though, that any type of intervention, and that includes controlling the temperature of your wine with stainless steel that has coils in it that cool the tank, is an intervention. Overall, when you talk about a stainless steel tank versus something like cement, is usually the shape. A lot of cement is usually egg shaped, and that actually creates during the fermentation a stirring process inside of the tank. So because of the fermentation, the wine essentially stirs itself, and that can help during a natural winemaking process protect against things like volatile acidity, which is usually, it does come from a type of, it's called, I wrote it down because I always forget these things when I'm trying to talk about them. It's an acidic bacteria that when you don't stir the wine or your skins start to get dry in red winemaking, it can add, in the best sense, a very slight amount of almost like balsamic vinegar characteristic, like you get in Italian wines. Like, why does Amarone have balsamic to it? Well, because you dry the skins of the grape, right? We think about these dried skins of the grape. You get it in Barolo and Barbaresco because your juice spends so much time with the skin. And just kind of regular everyday winemaking, you don't want any of that. So the cement will help stir the wine. Otherwise, if you're in other types of tanks, that's why you do either punch downs or pump overs. It's to one, submerge that cap so you can take the color and the tannins out of the skins and into the wine, but also to prevent that exotic bacteria from working, right? In the worst case, if you're fermenting in non-temperature controlled stainless steel, and you're not managing that cap, if you have that acidic bacteria, your wine in the very worst case will be like acetone or like nail polish remover or vinegar. And I think we've smelled that before in natural wines. And sometimes in wines that are not considered or called by that name natural, right? So that's one of the bigger things about using that shape of the concrete. The other thing is stainless steel is inert, so there's no contact really with oxygen if you have it capped off. Concrete does actually allow for a very, very small exchange of oxygen, which to a lot of styles of wine is actually beneficial. It increases the complexity of the wine when oxygen changes some of those dynamics, right?
Yeah, I agree. In terms of the cement that because of the porousness, that eventually some oxygen is going to get in there because of that. And, you know, as you just stated, that can be beneficial. Yeah.
And there's another school of thought that in introducing some or small amounts of oxygen early on in the winemaking protect it from oxidizing prematurely later on. And, you know, we can talk a lot about like faults in wine. One of the bigger, so like you get the VA, sometimes Brettanomyces, which is a strain of yeast that's a little like barnyardy sometimes in natural wines. If your winery has to be impeccably clean to make natural wine, because you're not going to then take any of those flaws out of the wine, right? The other thing that you tend to get is this, what we call mousiness in a wine. And it's like a lactobacillus bacteria that gets into the wine, and you can never smell it and you can't taste it until like a few seconds after you've swallowed the wine. But it's like people describe it as this almost like dog breath flavor of the wine, like stale popcorn. And you know, every single person has their own kind of personal threshold for what they can stand in any type of flavor, right? Of anything, in any type of food or any type of beverage, right? And so a lot of people have varying reactions and sensitivity to some of these, what we sometimes call flaws in natural wine. Mousiness for me, I can't stand it at all. If a wine has any of it, I can't drink it. It's like unpalatable. But I can withstand like a higher amount of volatile acidity than some of like my coworkers or friends can. So it's, you know, it's a little bit of a personal preference too.
It's all about the palate. Yes.
That was a lot. Thank you guys for staying with me.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. You did a great job.
Thank you, Amber.
I'll be sending out again the recording tomorrow, some follow-up information, but you know, please always reach out if you have any questions. It's really nice to see everybody.
Yes, great. Thank you very much.
I see your name on the screen. So thank you so much. Everybody have a great night. All right.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.